Good evening. You're watching a special edition of Face to Face, where we break down the issues that matter most to Poland, Europe and the world. I'm Aaron Dahmen. On May 18, Poles will vote for their next president. And with the election campaign now in full swing, we're talking the race to the palace with Leszek Jażdżewski, Editor-in-Chief at Liberte. Mr. Jażdżewski, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let's start with Mr. Rafał Trzaskowski. He's the centrist frontrunner. He's leading comfortably in the polls. His right-wing competitors, they're fighting amongst themselves. Is he sure on bet to be the next president of Poland?
We have to remember that his party, Civic Platform, actually lost two last presidential races, and in 2015 they lost very unexpectedly. So I do believe that Rafał Trzaskowski, even though he might think he has a highway to presidency, he is very cautious, especially if you look at the polls. The right-wing voters, they actually are close to 50%. So it's just a question whether they're going to support the candidate in the second round.
So could you see a reality where Mr. Trzaskowski gets, let's say, in the late 30s in the first round, but once you get to the second round, it becomes much tighter?
Everyone believes it's going to be very tight. And of course, it's a question whether it's sort of like being cautious or if it's real. I do think that in terms of voters, there is 50% majority to vote for the right-wing candidate. The realities of politics is actually very different. So you don't have a majority coalescing behind one candidate. You have divided right. And this is the reason why Trzaskowski, not having an absolute majority, still is secure to be the next Polish president.
What do you think could still derail Trzaskowski's campaign? 7 weeks is a long time in politics.
It's very true. You know, I think he's running a pretty good campaign, and it's a tight ship. And we have to be quite speculative what might happen. I think, in a way, what's the biggest challenge for him is those unforeseen events here in Warsaw. If anything happens while he's a mayor and he is out on a trail, on a campaign trail, anything happens like the disaster with Czajka, it was like the environmental sort of catastrophe a couple of years back, that could really backfire. But until really something unexpected happens, like major Donald Trump intervention, for example, in Polish presidential elections, I think he's on a right way, on a winning path.
You mentioned Donald Trump. Do you think that if Donald Trump intervened in some way, let's say, I mean, this is purely hypothetical, but he came to visit Poland and he somehow made a comment that favoured law and justice, would that actually resonate with voters? Because security in Ukraine is such a hot topic for this election too.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. And if we see the Trump intervention until recently, it actually seems that it goes very opposite way. I mean, if you look at Canada and if you look at other countries which are confronting Donald Trump, so whenever... And
in Germany, J.D. Vance's comments barely made a dent. Absolutely.
So it's a good politics to be anti-Trump. With Poland, it's quite different because we so much rely on US, on our security. But I do believe that Trump can have an effect. I mean, if there is any sort of peace deal with Russia over Ukraine, that could have an effect, and actually Trump will be seen as a sort of asset, not liability. Now I think being very pro-Trump could be actually a liability, because then you might be seen as a pro-Russian. So it's a very big question for right-wing candidates, what to do vis-à-vis Donald Trump.
OK, Karol Nawrocki, relatively unknown, little to no political or international experience. He was meant to be the face, the star of the right wing. He's backed by the major opposition Law and Justice Party. What's gone wrong?
You know, the problem is that he didn't get through the first level of this race. And the first level is to actually get recognized by your own base. And I think he was chosen to win the second round, to sort of pretend to be a Confederacja, a right-wing party sort of candidate, being a Law and Justice party. But I think many people, the supporters of Law and Justice, traditional supporters, haven't realized yet that this is actually the candidate of Law and Justice. Which is even worse for Karol Nawrocki. They actually got to know him and then decided, we don't like him, we have someone better.
Let's talk about his campaign, because on one hand he's been touring Poland, he's been gripping and grinning with locals, which usually works quite well in the regions because they get to see the candidate firsthand. But then he's faced these strange headlines over his past, these alleged mafia links. Has he been the target of unfair coverage, as the right might suggest, or are there real questions over his integrity as a candidate as well?
You know, he's really trying to avoid difficult questions asked by journalists, but I think it is his own biggest enemy, I'm afraid. It's not the question that, you know, he gets like unfair treatment. He's got like a question about Article 5, whether Poland would react due to Article 5 as a NATO
to help.
2
minutes to answer it.
Yeah, exactly, to help NATO ally. It's a very fair question because this is what really president in Poland is responsible for, is armed forces in some ways. And he didn't actually seem to know what Article 5 is. And you don't want this sort of person to be running your country. So I think it's a very much question of his own incompetence rather than being treated unfairly.
Does he need to be more decisive? Because you mentioned that interview, and for those that haven't seen it, I mean, this interview was, he was basically asked, look, would Poland come to the aid of the Baltics, if Russia were to invade? And he went back and forth, and eventually he got there to say that Poland needs to honour Article 5 and those NATO agreements. But what does that tell you about him as a candidate and him as a potential president when he can't answer a question like that decisively?
I do believe that this is a sort of person that doesn't know the right answer, and he doesn't know whether he wants to say yes, which is the right thing to say, or he thinks more, okay, it might hurt me in the polls, because actually I think a lot of Polish people don't realize, and I've seen some polling to support this argument, that actually it is Poland that have to come to help Latvia or Lithuania or Estonia. It's not just United States coming to help us. We also need to help others. So I think he's sort of shy, you know, he's pretending that he's very masculine, but at the same time, he's trying to avoid tough stances on issues, which we'll have to challenge as a president.
Sławomir Mentzen, he's this dark horse character in this race. He's been drawing in young people on social media. Probably international viewers might even know who he is because of his presence on social media. He's been echoing Russian narratives. He's also pulled neck and neck up in the polls with Nawrocki. Is this momentum, is it real, or is it just social media buzz?
You know, I think it was actually yesterday. That was this big interview of Mentzen on Channel Zero, and I think it got like a record 300 million views. You know, it's crazy. You know, for a country like less than 40 million. And I think it didn't go well for Mr. Mentzen. I think he sort of revealed his stances on abortion. He's very far right. He's very anti-abortion. He's still saying that, okay, even a raped woman needs to go through the abortion. I mean, he's against abortion even if woman is raped. And so I do think that his online momentum might be over. Of course, he's like almost like the only game in town in terms of social media. But people now try to treat him seriously. And I do believe it's not good for him. Before he was social media phenomenon. Now he's treated seriously as a candidate and really backfired.
What's interesting to me is that both Trzaskowski and Nawrocki campaigns tell me they are confident that those two will finish number 1 and 2, as was initially expected. Do you agree that you expect these two to be in the final runoff on the 1st of June?
If you look at who is actually voting Polish elections, you realise there's about 10 million people over 65, over 60 actually, who are voting, and 70% of them who have the right to vote, and over 70% of them actually do vote. And among those, Mentzen has like 5 to 8% of support, and the Nawrocki and Trzaskowski, they have the majority of the votes. So I think as long as Mentzen doesn't have like a dent in the support of, especially of Nawrocki by the older voters, it'll be very hard for him to do that because he doesn't have this channels to approach them. I think those two main candidates can be pretty secure, but at the same time, as we discussed before, Nawrocki's campaign might be collapsing anytime soon, and then, of course, anything can happen.
Who would be the most challenging candidate for Trzaskowski, Mentzen or Nawrocki in the second round?
You know, I think he's very well prepared for Nawrocki. So from this perspective, Nawrocki is ideal candidate. But at the same time, the Mentzen is a bit unpredictable. Of course, it's hard to imagine that someone who, until very recently, got like 8% of support now will get to 51%. And whether Law and Justice, the main opposition party, would actually support another right-wing candidate who is not from the party. So it's very hard to say if Mentzen can win with Trzaskowski, but I think at least he has a chance to rally the sort of anti-system, all the right-wing sort of voters behind himself. I think it doesn't work the same way with Nawrocki.
If we look at the broader picture, Poland has become a key power in European affairs in recent years. That's different from when Poland was under law and justice. Is that at risk in this presidential election?
Well, I do believe that if we have a candidate from the opposition winning those elections, that the Polish position on international sphere will be fairly diminished, and not just because of the format of those candidates, which is relatively minuscule, but also that basically you would have a divided executive power here in Poland. So I do believe in the very good interest of Poland is to have undivided executive power and to have the coalition candidate to win.
We briefly talked about it before, but Ukraine, the issue of Russia, security, that is the key buzzword Trzaskowski's campaign tells me. And it's clear when you listen to him on the road. I mean, he's talking about NATO, the EU, transatlantic relationship. Those are all key talking points. I'm interested in your perspective on this because elections are often won on domestic issues like the economy. So what's different this time around?
I really respect him for saying this because it's really what the president is responsible for. At the same time, this is what people got on the news that feel very uncertain about the future. What we see in the polls is that people really do care about the prices or the social care or the health care. And this is not really the responsibility of the president. What I think is different is that actually this campaign has been sort of diminished by this geopolitical, Donald Trump, this dimension, Russia, Ukraine. So I think he has to sort of respond. And also, it is his biggest asset. He's the only candidate with any sort of international experience, unlike Nawrocki or Mentzen.
Both Nawrocki and Mentzen have been using rhetoric rebelling against this sort of old global world order, also rebelling against Ukrainians. What do you make of that?
If you're about this sort of world order, it is the one that gave us, at least in Poland, like more than 30 years of peace and prosperity. And going against it, it can only mean trouble. It doesn't necessarily mean war, but it means trouble. So if you are against Ukraine, you have to remember this is what really defending us from Russian invasion. If you are saying, okay, US go your own way, you can go along your international interest lines, national interest lines, that means, okay, you don't want NATO here to help us. If you're anti-European, when US are against Europe and NATO, it's a question, okay, do you believe that Poland can stand against Russia single-handedly? So, yes, it is very much about the national interest of Poland and the future of this country, those elections.
What does that rhetoric mean for the second round? Because here you have Rafał Trzaskowski, reasonably consistent, predictable in how he views NATO, the EU, the transatlantic relationship, and then you have the more extreme rhetoric on the right. But then when you have to try and convince 50% of the country to vote for you, will they have to tamper down that rhetoric? And will that give a bit of a free hit to Trzaskowski to say, hey, look, these guys aren't authentic?
Well, I do believe that if you compare this international credibility, how people understand security, NATO, Trzaskowski obviously more competent. What I think they would try to do, they would try to challenge his credibility, that he's changed, his position on many issues in the past, that he represents Donald Tusk government, which is not very popular. So I think the conflict will be down to personalities and sort of everyday politics here in Poland, not international issues.
OK, let's map out some scenarios. So if Trzaskowski wins, at the moment here in Poland, you have this paralysing cohabitation. You've got President Andrzej Duda, who's backed by Law and Justice in the past, and then you have Prime Minister Donald Tusk, the Civic Coalition. So they don't work well together. Will that paralysing cohabitation end immediately if Mr Trzaskowski wins? Donald Tusk's agenda unlocked, he can do what he likes, or is it more complicated than that?
Well, it's a very good question, to be honest. I don't know. And I think we should hope that they can, as a government, sort of restart, like to start from anew, because they were really paralyzed. But they were also paralyzed not just because of lacking the president supporting them, but also because it's a coalition government. And we didn't have that many parties in the government, I think, in 25 years. So it's going to be very complicated to get things done in the parliament. And they're going to lose the excuse of not voting things through because of Andrzej Duda, the current president. So there is a hope of sort of recalibrating this government. If they want to win 2027 elections, they have to do it. The Tusk needs to grab the power finally, fully, But at the same time, I do think that his coalition partners might be thinking, okay, we need to preserve our own parties. We need to support to preserve our support for our politics. It's going to be very, very difficult for Tusk to get things through this coalition government.
On a foreign affairs front, I mean, we've seen situations where President Duda said one thing and either Foreign Minister Trzaskowski or indeed Prime Minister Tusk has said another. Does or would a Trzaskowski presidency give Tusk more space to manoeuvre, that he isn't so constrained by these domestic divisions also on the world stage?
I think Tusk so far didn't really care that much about Duda, but obviously in situations where Duda had to go to US, had to go to China, the president is by constitution, it's his obligation to work together with government on foreign affairs. It wasn't the case with the current president. A future president, I think, will be very much in support of Donald Tusk politics, and he will be a sort of spokesman for Poland. And of course, it doesn't mean that he will be subjected to Tusk in any ways, but they are basically from the same camp. They work together for a long time. I don't really believe that Trzaskowski would be in any fundamental way diverging from what Donald Tusk policy is on the international stage.
So on the flip side, Nawrocki or Mentzen, if they win in the second round and one of them enters the presidential palace, will this paralysis continue? Is that what you expect? And not just that, but could it collapse the current governing coalition?
You know, okay, starting from the second question, I do believe that this coalition would have the very strong sort of self-preservation modes on to get through, and they will have to try to position themselves as a sort of anti-law and justice, anti-Nawrocki in this situation. I think it will be even, it's hard to imagine, but even more polarization than we have now. And if Nawrocki would be president on the international stage, he's going to be very unpredictable because, you know, even looking at the law and justice, he's not a career politician. We don't know anything about his past. I mean, the only things we know are actually terrible. It's almost like you have like a Millwall hooligan club, you know, guys who's like, you know, the head of the supporters of the stadium becoming a president of the country. No, it's really the guy who is a sort of accidental politician in many ways. I don't think even Law and Justice knows what he's going to do. And he is very far right, very anti-Ukrainian. He might be even, you know, pro-Putin, pro-Russian. It's going to be extremely dangerous.
And I guess the question is, in the context of that, do you believe we could see an early snap election?
I think it's not going to be in the interest of the current coalition. As long as they maintain the integrity, I think it's quite unlikely. But there are some constitutional maneuvers around the budget which president can use if, of course, Nawrocki is this president. And then this coalition might not survive another 3 years. So I don't believe it's going to happen, but it's not completely unlikely.
And lastly, speaking of the Civic Coalition, speaking of elections, they've seen a strong result in a party poll this week. So Civic Coalition 31%, Law and Justice 26.5%, Confederation in third on 16.4%. I'm interested, do you think the presidential race has any bearing on these numbers? I mean, could Trzaskowski's own success be a bump for Civic Coalition, or is it just a flash in the pan?
Well, absolutely. I mean, Trzaskowski is way more popular than his party. I mean, at least, you know, he's got a couple of percentage more than his own party. So obviously his good results in the polls so far are driving the party up. At the same time, we have to bear in mind, it's not that Civic Coalition has got more votes in terms of like millions of people voting for them. Just the proportion of people voting is higher. I think actually you see the collapse of support for the coalition partners, and you can see that Donald Tusk is basically the only politician who's making decisions within this government. The other politicians don't really matter. So I think in the short run it's great news for Civic Platform. In the long run, who is going to be the coalition partner after next elections?
Watch this space. Leszek Jażdżewski, Editor-in-Chief at Liberte. Thank you again for your time.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
And that's Face to Face on TVP World for tonight. I'm Dahmen. We'll see you next week.